the ability to ideate on a game, if we're going to use Dota as the example, Dota to League, Valorant is another example. These are games that people really truly thought of, considered, and sort of messed around with in the realm of an original game. That's especially true in Dota and Warcraft 3, right? So I think that's totally viable now as a solution where people can do, right, different UGC type things, and they can port them pretty quickly into an experience. And that's especially true on other platforms that enable it. It feels like the proliferation of democratized access to tools is going to have a big effect on smaller studios' ability to compete.
Hey everyone, welcome to the second episode of All Chat, a new podcast where we're aiming to deliver an unfiltered view behind the scenes of some of the most interesting and current topics within the gaming industry, startups more broadly, and venture capital. Joining us once again on this episode, we have Stephen Lim, the founder of Raidbase and recently the creator and executive producer behind Valorant at Riot Games. We're also joined by another Riot alum, Jordan Mazer, who's currently head of talent for Andreessen Horowitz's games. Finally, there's Brian and myself, the co-founders of Patron, an early-stage venture firm with strong focus on gaming and consumer startups. Prior to founding Patron, we helped to scale Riot from 0 to 1, joining the company before League of Legends launched and helping build out publishing, esports, business, and corporate development as the company developed into one of the most valuable gaming companies in the world. Now let's dive into our discussion about the people side of the games industry.
Well, why don't we start off with the layoffs in the industry? I think that's obviously one thing that's top of mind for everybody that's, working in game development right now. There's a lot of companies cutting people and, it's obviously really painful. But yeah, what's your guys' perspective as it relates to how that impacts the overall, job market? How should game developers be thinking about what's happening? I guess personally, I've seen this kind of play out back in 2009 when I started working in games. This is back in, the great financial crisis, and there's a lot of jobs that just got cut, and it was super painful. But I think on the flip side, it feels like the industry's grown a lot too. So I think you kind of have to take a step back and think about the overall pie. It's certainly expanded a lot from what it used to be. Love to get your guys' take as it relates to what's happened and where this is all going.
Yeah. I can at least just start with numbers. There's some very easy numbers on this. To your point, Brian, since 2010, from 2010 to 2019, the market went from about 125,000 jobs here in the US market to 230,000 jobs. So huge increase in the total volume. And then over the next ensuing 3 years throughout COVID, right, all these companies grew to a degree that was, I think, untenable, which is now what we're seeing play out because the continued demand for the games that were being published at the time it's not what it was then. And just some numbers in those 3 years, right? EA, 31% growth, Take-Two, 34% growth, Roblox, 101% growth, Activision, 37%, Riot, 47% over those 3 years. In the last year, per that Axios article that came out, I think it was yesterday, there were 6,000 jobs so far that were affected by layoffs, which is effectively 2.5% of the global market, US market. So at least to me, while it's terrible, it's unfortunate so many people are losing their jobs, their families are affected, I think it is very reasonable sort of pullback, and that it doesn't really signal this sort of landslide that's about to come. I don't see it sort of going in that direction. It just feels like a leveling off of growth that will continue once, right, the demand is met again, and there's a need to continue growing those organizations. So that's my simple view.
It's certainly high contrast from a year ago or semi-recently. So the felt difference is pretty dramatic. But to all of your points, in the grand scheme of things, I guess in general, we should be thankful that there's such a growth period in the whole space, that there's as many jobs as there are. Gaming roles and jobs were just not prevalent 20 years ago. You'd have to really scrounge really deeply, go to pretty ridiculous extents to be able to get into the industry today, between tooling, the breadth of opportunities at startups, which brain drained and not brain drained, but basically create a vacuum in a lot of the bigger companies, which cascaded to more opportunities there. It's, in one way of looking at it, better than it's been over the long course of time. But obviously, any loss of jobs is like regrettable. Where my brain kind of goes to as a initial reaction to what's going on recently is how do we not get this to happen again later? And when I say this, maybe let's be specific. Layoffs at all, and this like maybe felt dramatic difference between highs and lows. I love working on games with dramatic highs and lows, but real life should be like pretty chill and like stable, in my opinion. And then obviously the world is hard enough as it is. So, so when I think about those two things, I do think that when times are good, there was a gross overinflation of everything. Startups that shouldn't have been started, projects that spun up that shouldn't have been, each project like expanding way beyond where its stage was ready for. And so when the effects of not being ready to be at those sizes was quickly unsustainable, and then compounded, and this is where we really feel this dramatic difference, compounded with the pullback in the general market, those two things, man, are like a two-hit combo that that lead to some of the more drastic feeling and drastic, I guess, as objectively as you can look at it, actions with entire studios closing. There's kind of like this thresholds of breaking. There has to be thresholds of breaking points where you dip below that breaking point. It's like either going to just keep cascading down. And it's like irrecoverable, or it's just like it's broken and it's not sustainable. Of course, like we all want to see growth. We want to see growth at large for the industry. We want to see growth individually for ourselves, and all the more do I love and encourage like people getting paid more in our industry and everything. But I think I stop short personally where it's if it's past sustainable. I think you have to be really careful about asking for more personally or at large, because if it can't, I want long-term growth for this industry. So the short-term highs and lows is something I hope we can mitigate more and be more chill about in general, so that we can enjoy long-term growth at large. I think those two things are associated. I don't think we get to long-term growth by taking all opportunity in the short term. I think we can literally see like tech algorithms with the same kind of principle. Like the greedy algorithm basically isn't necessarily the fastest or best or most effective way of getting to certain goals and outcomes, which we all share. So of course there's like range, and of course this is not like an absolute rule or anything like that. But on average, I think having a more steady hand in the good times and in the hard times will hopefully reduce the band of difference of like the felt effects. Otherwise, if times are good and we crazy spend, then I think we're seeing the effects now where when times are harder, you feel it may be 2.5% at large, of pullback, but entire studios are closing, which is very dramatic for those people. And the industry is small enough that we all know first order like people who are dramatically affected by that, and you want to help, and most studios are now feeling like they're lucky enough to not have to lay off right now, let alone be able to hire. So you're not able to help even if you wanted to, if you stay at these extremes. So it is tough, even if it's on paper only 2.5%. We all know people who were directly affected by layoffs. We want to help, and there are many cases where we want to help when we are very limited in how we can help. And even if studios aren't laying off, we're also seeing a lot of studios not able to hire, which doesn't help the influx of talent that's floating around. For anyone who is, sorry, go ahead. I can keep on.
No, I was going to say, what do you think is causing like some of this short-term pain, right? I think the obvious thing is like, yeah, like everyone was overspending in 2020, 2021. It just felt like just the industry was going to grow even faster. And by the way, like taking a step back, it's not like the game industry is shrinking this year, right? From like an overall like growth dollars perspective, like it still continues to grow, maybe not at the trajectory that people thought. But I guess going deeper into what you're saying, Slim, like, do you think it's just people were too aggressive around greenlighting projects that should have not gone greenlit? Is it just people wanted to like throw more bodies at the problem? Like, yeah, just like, what do you think specifically people, especially like founders, like how should they be thinking about it? And Jordan, you might have a perspective too, obviously, because you probably see more overall industry data. But I guess like going deeper, like what do you think is like some of the lessons that we can think about?
There's a couple things that
builders.
fly through my head right now that may be incomplete, but maybe we can like beat up together. Is there was a general notion, or is a general notion, that growth equals progress. And I do not agree with that at all. I can see why people agree with that. I don't think it's invalid. There are many cases where growth is a reflection of progress. But I think the inverse is not necessarily true. Growth does not equal progress necessarily. And there was a lot of encouragement, not necessarily by investors, but also by investors, but also just by peers, or like comparing, people are competitive, and you look at each other's like progress and you're like, oh, you guys are only like 20 people, you guys are only 60 people. And it's like a measure of like, oh, we're doing stuff and we're making our game, which is exciting and could be a really good indicator. But, as we're seeing a lot of games accelerate towards their launches, because many of them, because they were imminently about to run out of runway, their games were obviously not ready. Obvious in the sense that like the market reflected that, not like my judgment. That I think could have been mitigated. I don't know what preventable, but mitigated along the way by not artificially pumping. Well, I don't think anyone intends to, or necessarily is like pumping for artificial reasons, but somewhere along the way there must have been some kind of misassessment of like where we are, and are we ready for this scale or this size or these steps, or this, are we really at this phase of development? And there must be some disconnect there, because once the market gave feedback, it reflected that it was not ready. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes partly to there aren't clear milestones for when you should scale your team, and I think like everyone, like investors, the founders, like team members, like is involved in all of this. Is that, and I think one challenge from the last from 2021, 2022, when capital was much more readily available, is that a lot of companies were, like private companies were overfunded, a lot of public companies were significantly overvalued. And so there was a sense that you needed to like deploy some of that capital, which was available, in order to like scale teams faster, to build faster, to ship faster. And I think to your point, Slim, like just because you have money doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right point in time to like step on the gas. And so just curious, I guess, from both of your standpoint, like what are things that you guys think about in terms of like, when does it make sense to start like leaning in and scaling different teams, and especially within kind of the game development framework?
I have strong opinions on this as a
you're gonna go.
Wait, go ahead first.
You first, Slim. It's okay.
No. Go.
All right, I'll just share. I want to share two important things that I think need to be disentangled just briefly. One is that there are always going to be some number of small companies that are going from hit to hit, and when they miss, they will potentially die. Yeah. Right? It's just part of the regular life cycle of especially smaller businesses who don't have the same degree of capital or right track record or any number of things to sustain themselves after the fact. That would have happened this year and last year and the year before, and et cetera. So there's, in that 6,000 number, there's some that are just part of the regular course of life for many of these companies. For a bunch of the larger companies, for, right, I guess a Riot, an EA, a Unity, a Active, whatever, it feels to me that the problems that they had are very different, as you were just saying, Jason, than the problems that some of those smaller startups have, because they were either predicting a level of interest or demand for their games, or to your point, they felt a need to invest at that moment. So I want to make sure that when people think about the broad ecosystem, they're not forgetting that this is just part of the life of companies.
Of course, yeah.
I'm guessing that Slim will very much say this, but I just want to say, like, the first part is like, do you actually have a game or concept, an idea that is fun and that is worth putting a significant amount of resources against? I feel like for a lot of the companies that overinvest, they want to get incredible talent, giant leadership teams, a series of VPs or directors, many of whom aren't necessarily, folks who can actually contribute right away to a title, or who can help prototype, or who can help move towards something that is interesting. And when that's the case, they get put into a very difficult spot because many of them cannot actually do the work. They might not know where they're going in the first place. And then they start, burning considerable amount of resources, because game talent is not cheap, even in the startup ecosystem. So I think the first step is at least having a pretty strong idea about what you're trying to build before you're resourcing for polish, for completion, for a number of things that obviously are critical to find before you try and quote unquote scale the organization.
I very much agree with all that. And I guess the main thing I want to convey is my base, mode of operation of like crawl, walk, run. So applied here on this topic, I think what we want to see is some amount of the engagement that we want to eventually see. So if you have a very rough gray box version of your game, it may not sustain like a large audience yet, but you want to see some amount of the behaviors that you hope to see later as you layer on and stack upon this foundation. So somebody somewhere should be not stopping playing your game, if that's the outcome that you want to see at some point early on. And there's this what is very difficult about this for every kind of game and team is a chicken and egg feeling that when you build it, they will come kind of thing. So like, if you don't see that engagement yet, it's tempting to say, oh, but when we do this and this, then they'll come. So let's just like put more gas on that. And that is true for anyone. Despite me preaching this step, we do have to do like a critical mass for like a first step for the game loop to make sense for our game. Our game happens to be really complicated, so our timeline is more protracted because of that. And others, you might be able to test that literally in the first week, and with a lot less investment in art and a bunch of things. I mean, again, I love that we have examples like BattleBit and a number of other games. I mean, there's a number of games on the Roblox platform that without fancy graphics, they have such an engaging core loop that people come and play. That's not always available. Some experiences are about that high fidelity thing. If you're making, like you're going to expect that out of studios like Sony Santa Monica and Naughty Dog and DICE and stuff like that. Like they just don't get a pass for something like that. Or at least they haven't in general in the past. And so everyone's in a different situation with varying amounts of like weight on these things that they have to consider for their own soup. And so it's really hard to tell how do we go too far on any one of these steps? Like, are we putting too much faith in this thing? Oops, we hired too much. Oops, we weren't actually ready. That is all natural to varying degrees. And we all have to struggle with that. Now, something that I think paired with this concept is we're all eager to get that validation, but I think there's different ways of approaching it. So a common investor statement that is encouraged is like, let's like go to market faster. Let's test it, iterate. I think that is absolutely like generally a good thing to encourage, but that market doesn't have to be the wild public Twitter space or Steam charted thing, because if you go to the all the way to that, I think you spend a lot of trust currency and that's like a first impression you cannot take back. We try to do the same steps internally as much as we can. So just using Valorant just as an example, a lot of people see and maybe rightfully criticize is like, there's nothing. You guys have been building this for 7 years, and all of a sudden you come out and it's like, if it seems like a Hail Mary. But what we actually know internally to the team is we were testing with tastemakers that we could reach in the field from the first year. And we kept that up throughout the whole thing, which is an easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to pull off, because most game teams don't even have a build that they can reliably deploy and play test every week, let alone every day, as we did. I could count on two hands the number of days that we could not play test on demand in the entirety of that time, which was absolutely not free, and something to credit like so many people on, including our engineering team and Mike Evans and stuff. Like, it was like a very high priority that supported the design team, that supported our ability to connect to those tastemakers, even if it was just one person, even if it was just 5 people, even if it was just 10 people. Like, even at those scales, it was super not free to do that. And then
Slim, how possible is that for a startup? You were obviously heavily capitalized and backed by the will and might of Riot. So I'm curious, now are you able to do that for,
everything has trade-offs, and nothing is free. I would say we were doing this when we were literally 5 people in a room. So I think nearly any startup can do that, but at what cost? What are you trading off to do that? For us to keep that true, there was added friction to change rate. There was more of our time and effort spent on QAing ourselves rather than picking up another dedicated QA hire, or time spent to implement a new feature. So it's just this constant no right answer trade-off. And then let's say you make that sacrifice and you are able to play test on a whim, or at least every week. Do you get the mileage out of that you hope to? Because just doing the playtest alone, I think playtests are its own art form to get value out of. You have to learn to ask the right questions that are relevant to your team. You have to ask questions that are then leading to actionable things following. Versus what I hear very commonly is like, we playtest, oh, we knew all this already. Then, okay, why did you run the playtest? Why didn't you already spend that time fixing it instead? So then there's like, it's a little muddy. So I think a lot of people go through the motions of playtesting and these right actions, but don't actually get the value that they presume that they do. And so these things, I think, have to work in concert. And it is really muddy. There's not an exact right answer, particularly in that there's vast differences between each game and their complexities and unknowns and newness that they're dealing with. But it has to be done, I think, very consciously and deliberately to get the value out, to help to mitigate, like by the time you get all the way to the end, you're like, we're releasing, and it's like the game dies in a month. Like, that should not ever be a surprise, in my opinion. You should have seen that coming way before. I don't know, maybe you knew that, but you just Hail Married and hoped because maybe you ran out of choices. But then I think, again, that behooves all of us who are influencers or leaders within our teams and our products and our teams to be as responsible as we can to mitigate that along the way as possible. And again, even on these actions, even if they're a good idea, are not free. Like, to resist the temptation to just hire. And again, we've been in a very fortunate position where our investors have been very empathetic, patient. We haven't had to do much resistance, but in most cases, in most setups, you do have to resist that. And even if it wasn't for investor pressure, even investors, by the way, there's like extremes here aren't helpful either. Like, some investors will be like, oh, so we are like, we don't know how to make games. We're totally hands off. Like, you can ask questions like, what did you do in this past month? What did you do like this past few months? Like, it's okay to ask that. Like, I would even encourage it. Like, just all of us being ready to answer that is, I think, a responsibility as devs to be able to be ready to answer that for players. I think we need to be able to have that for new hires, for our own team. I think we need to be ready to like do that as part of our responsibility set. So I think it's okay for investors to ask questions like that, to just, hey guys, like, what are you doing over there? And we should be able to like, be, okay, we're doing this and this for these reasons. And then it's everyone can decide whether or not that's like reasonable or whatever level there. But I think it's okay to do that. And then the other extreme of like, like the old school, and which still happens, by the way, the milestone gate thing, where
that committee,
where like, to get this next tranche, you do this, like make 2 more characters and 3 more levels, like, has its own drastic effects of forcing the team to be very short-sighted. If you are always only going from milestone to milestone, you're very disincentivized to invest anything into your game product that takes more than those milestones, because you're like, well, we live or die. It feels like a crisis where everything you want to pour into like surviving that next milestone check, and then the real thing that everyone wants is this thing landing or not. you weren't able to invest in some things that took many milestones to do. And so either extreme is like not necessarily good or successful. And of course you can like find examples at those extremes, but like I think it's more gambling when you push it to the extremes. So anyway, I veered off quite a bit here, but like crawl, walk, run is like, I think a general goal here that I think can mitigate some of these more extreme examples that we're seeing lately.
I think on the flip side for startups, especially for folks building games, I could also see the other part of the argument where, like, it's like Jordan said, right? You're undercapitalized. You already don't have a lot of resources. And when you go to market, like if you're going to have to go up against like these AAA games or even like indie games that you describe, where they just already have like a lot of traction and community, it is hard. And I think that also goes to the question of like, defensibility. Like that I think is probably one of the toughest things if you're building a studio is like, the world of like Riot spending years innovating on Dota into creating League of Legends, like that world is no longer possible, it feels like, based on how quickly like some of the incumbents and like these bigger studios move. So yeah, I guess like what's your guys' take? Like how do founders operate in that world where your ability to like really have innovation and like use that almost as a moat and then like build a team right off of that? That's a lot harder than what it used to be, right?
I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting to assume that the large companies are faster. They have, of course, more resources and more people. But with more people typically comes
Complexity.
More bureaucracy, more arguing, more egos, more IP council, more any number of prohibitive factors towards forward movement, number one, especially if it's like the 5th, 6th, 7th product, because now there's all these different norms and whatever that you need.
There's another one where a big company poo-poos a lot of ideas because in general, their environments are like people, it's hard to be right because people don't want to stick their neck outs, and it's easy to like throw rocks at ideas. Or like, oh, this is some like kid game. This is some small thing. This is like not even number 10 on Steam. Like they'll just you hear that all day long at a big company.
Yeah. So there's all of those challenges. Now, the gap between the startup and the larger company is certainly their ability, at least you would think, to quickly make the technologies, the art, whatever it is. And at least I know we're going to talk about AI at some point, but I feel like that is a gap that maybe can to some degree, or a gulf that can to some degree be bridged by development teams today through the application and use of other resources, whether it's quicker concepting or an ability to code more quickly because of Copilot. Now, of course, both sides are going to have this technology, but my belief is that the technology itself won't help the pace or delivery of the larger companies as much as it will the smaller ones, because they're still going to be stuck in the mire of all the problems of trying to agree on what they can and should make, whereas a smaller company will be able to very quickly put those in place and to leverage them because they're not stymied by the first part of that equation. So I don't think necessarily that the bigger companies always have that advantage as it's described. And I also really believe that the ability to ideate on a game, if we're going to use Dota as the example, Dota to League, that effectively, Valorant is another example. These are games that people really truly thought of, considered, and sort of messed around with in the sort of realm of an original game. That's especially true in Dota and Warcraft 3, right? So I think that's totally viable now as a solution where people can do different UGC type things and they can port them pretty quickly into an experience. And that's especially true on other platforms that enable it. So I don't know. It feels like the proliferation of democratized access to tools is going to have a big effect on smaller studios' ability to.
I think you said like Roblox and UEFN being like places where you can fast prototype a lot of these experiences at scale where you already have like hundreds of millions of users. But I think Brian's point was more that to go from Dota into Demigod and Heroes of New Earth and then League, like that actually took like many years. Whereas to go from like auto chess to TFT was like a couple months. And I think that's one thing where it's like, well, if Riot, Tencent, Supercell, Epic, whoever sees that there is some kind of game that's tangential to something they've already built, their ability to like spin a team up and actually create something that is like very high quality is going to be much faster than any, regardless of how much venture capital you raise, like will be much faster than any startup. But then that goes to, I think an earlier point was around, well, it also matters a lot. Like, what space are you building in? Are you building in a space? Are you trying to compete for talent against like incumbents and developers that have much better talent and also are actively building in those areas? And I think those are going to be the areas that are going to be trickier for like upstart studios to really be able to have traction. Yeah.
I think you
Yeah,
guys
I think it's the point you guys made where we like ideas that are not like incremental, but it's like, startups that are like creating a new market, right? Maybe Roblox is one example. Like that genre of game didn't like really exist. Like you can argue there was like UGC and all of that stuff, but how a lot of the young kids play Roblox is very different. And I think a lot of traditional game developers looked at that and, like, to your point, Slim, just felt like this was more of like a toy or like a distraction. So I think that's probably like the nuance that's important is like, I think for startups, you do have to be, you probably need to be building something or like doing something that is fundamentally, it's different than a lot of these bigger studios are going to go and do whatever they're going to do in their own time, right?
I think all of your observations are really on point, and with certainly, I think certain game spaces or genres are more vulnerable to the fast, hard, big follow thing, especially where like there's a formula that is easier to understand and easier to mimic. I think there is more defensibility in games that have appealed as a matter of taste, which build a certain moat of brand, where you're like, you don't want the knockoff version in some cases, where there's awareness or appreciation for that brand. There's a little bit of moat there. There's some systemic design moat where seemingly minor tunings that you think you're duplicating lead to very, very different player outcomes and decisions that therefore lead to a very different experience, even if the feature set looks really similar. I think there's a lot of like competitive games that have like a systemic moat as a result, and games that are let's just say RPG games, anything like an RPG with like stats and stuff like that, like very minor tunings can have a very dramatic course of action or decisions. Basically, it's very different
PUBG
games.
versus Fortnite, right?
Oh, PUBG, Fortnite, H1Z1. Like, how different are they on the back of the box bullet points? Like, they're pretty similar. Fortnite obviously looks more different because of the building. But look at how dramatic the difference was between H1Z1 and PUBG. They're both on the surface pretty janky. Like, I don't think PUBG won on a polish thing, but as an example, I'm like recalling back 6-7 years ago. Forgive me for this to be a little off, but like one example is H1Z1. From what I recall, maybe this was only for a time. It didn't apply any damage when you jump out of a car. So some behaviors that you see is like people will drive in a semicircle around it. They'll identify a target, drive around looking for a target, and when they see a target, they'll drive a semicircle and drop people off, like basically in a semicircle, and surround and get like a tactical advantage. So whoever they surrounded can't like shoot everyone, and so they would do this. But PUBG applied severe damage at like different velocities, and that behavior didn't happen. And so you got a lot more of a fair fight between different teams. Now, who's wearing some suit that would identify that as a potential reason for the difference between H1Z1 or PUBG, right? Like, but they're just like, I don't get it. Like we did all the things and we made it shinier and like no one showed up. Like people are experiencing that right now for the innumerable BR copycats, extraction copycats. Like they don't appreciate these nuances that have dramatic player differences or player behavior differences in there. And that part is like a big fat good luck. Try to copy that. Like, that's like one example, but there will literally be hundreds per game. That took many years to come to, not just each individual decision, but how they worked in concert with the other, which is essentially complexity moat. And so it's not to say it couldn't be done, but they would have to be as diligent as the original team to do it. So they basically would have done the work. It's like basically not exactly copyable. Like you could aim to mimic, you can aim to copy, but you have to reparse like, why did they reach the conclusion? Why does this work? Otherwise, you can't repeat it for, even if you can copy a moment in time of a game, how do you keep that going for the ongoing engagement that we all hope for and want in the next month, like the same, you could have mimicked a certain like moment in time, but if you don't have the calculus or the team that's doing the calculus to keep that going, then the reliability of that update is like really shaky. So I think with all that said, for however many teams that there are ready to, on a drop of a hat, copy a game, how many actually succeeded? At least to the large extent. I mean, there might be a lot, but at the moment I can name King of Glory. There's probably like 5 or 10 we can name off the bat right now, but for however many there are, there's probably like 50 teams of like, or 300 like ready to roll tomorrow from anywhere that are able to do that, and they don't. That they can't, or they try to. Like, how many character-based vertical battle royale shooters have there come and gone that we can't even name? Like, they put all that work. There's probably 800 people on each of those projects coming from a lot of the big name studios, and they're dead in like 2 weeks. Like, because you couldn't copy all those like tunings. Like, I think that's why. But I'm seeing it from a very game centric lens. So yeah,
it feels like the scalability answer for Slim. Like when you scale your team is when you have clarity of the concept of what you want to make. You have people who are extremely passionate. You can define who you need to be able to really create that experience because you know that you're going to go in a certain direction and they fit the sort of model. So you know what you're going to hire for to accomplish it, both in terms of like the genre, interest, fitness, etc. If you think it's critical, as Slim is, to sort of the success of the game, plus then whatever skills, because that has a big effect on the specific skills, the specific visual styles, the specific whatever it is that's required. So if we talk about like Valorant as an example, that's right. The technical needs for Valorant were very specific, and that had a bunch of engineering effects, for example, in terms of who had to be hired. Versus if you're making a game that is a CCG, there's a very different set of potential needs, and as a result, it defines the team and the team comp very differently. So at least if I'm like listening to Slim and thinking about the original questions, like what is it that I actually need to wait for until I decide that I want to hire and build my team out? I think it's very much product vision that enables you to be able to effectively produce the substrate, the hiring outcomes, and to avoid the pain of what happens when you hire half for one product and then you learn that you need to switch and you try to either form fit your resources into a new one, or you need to do something really painful and potentially lay people off. And the price of that is monumental, not only to your current team, but to your future hiring ability.
Your brand.
Especially for startup. The earlier it is and the more
you have nothing else. You have nothing else for your brand to be judged on but these actions. And so right off the bat, you're like off on the wrong foot. And what is already hard becomes even harder. Like when I've had conversations around this topic, I get a lot of like nodding heads. I'm like, oh yeah, cool. That's like obvious. Like we should do that. And yet I think the vast majority of the startups I've talked to so far have done hiring, in my opinion, out of order, where they're like off to the races and making stuff. And they're like, we're still looking for a game director. And you're like, whenever that happens, you're going to have to like recommit to whatever that guy does, or they bend to you and whatever momentum you already had and working within your constraints. Not to say either of these couldn't work, but it, again, like it's kind of like adds to like that false progress thing. It's like, why do you like 5 people?
I guess to that point, like what, I know it's not going to be like one size fits all, but like what is a good order? Like if you're a founder trying to build a game studio, like what are the critical, important, foundational leadership pieces that need to be in place before you start to really build out? Because I think that's a challenge. Like some of these game studios, they raise their first round of funding might be pretty significant. And so to that point, like you want to demonstrate that you're making progress, but making progress and just hiring people isn't necessarily like, if it's out of order, like you say, that could have like downstream negative consequences. Yeah.
I hate that. I worry that what I'm about to say will read as spicy, but I feel like it should be the most non-spicy thing. But don't even think about starting a project. Don't even think about putting your first check in if there is no designer for a game. Like, what are you doing? If like the whole thing lives or dies. Okay, let's be more specific. If you're making a game that you hope has a long-term engagement pattern, which is most of the ones being funded by VCs that are like aiming to be game services or highly social or anything like that. Like you basically need system designers. There are not that many system designers in the world, period. And if you can look for where they are based on the games that have lasted a long time. So there was a time period where I would have said that Riot had the majority of them because Riot was one of the only ones even practicing a game service. So not to say other people weren't capable, but they didn't have the practice, they didn't have the reps. Today, that's a very different scenario. There's many, many games that have lasted many, many years and are on the upswing. So there are a lot more viable system designers out there. But even, in the pool that I could see, there were a lot of system designers that were good in very critical ways, but had various other challenges. And then you have to consider like team makeup. How much do you want to build a team around this person, which is like a hard commit. If that person tilts one day, whether they leave the company or they stop being as viable, like you are kind of hard committed, and then you have to deal with that. So that's all what makes it really difficult and muddy as you proceed. But in general, you can't really like half commit. So, I think there's a series of like commitments and miracles that you have to pull off, which is maybe why we see so few like games that actually persist. It's like that's why it's all so difficult, I guess, to state the obvious. But if you proceed, when I say start with a designer, by the way, I'm not necessarily saying start with someone with a game designer title. That you're more. I think it's more important to look for the qualities. You can have. There are many games where someone was not a practicing. Was known as some other discipline, like they were an engineer or an artist, but maybe they were practicing these things, or maybe they practiced on the job, but they were focused on that systems design problems, which is problem solving, getting a bunch of competing outcomes to be aligned and work together versus like having a bunch of things that sound good in a vacuum, but then have a crazy challenge as like working together. I like using food analogies, but like, we could really like, Brian could really love strawberries. When we're talking about strawberries, we're all talking about Harry's Berry. It was like so freaking good. And then like another day we're talking with Jason about some Italian meal we eat and just some like tomatoes from the west slopes of Mount Vesuvius that we're all really into. Oh my God, it's so good. And then like you try to get it together and you're like strawberries and tomatoes like don't go together. And they're like now poor Jordan is sitting there trying to like get these two things resolved. And like, that's like ad nauseum 5 times a day in game dev. So some of this you can project and much of it you can't, but I see too little emphasis on this in general. Everyone just presumes like, oh, we'll figure it out later. Clearly that's not true for the vast majority of games that aren't working out. And when I say that, I'm not picking on the startups. Like if you look at Steam with its, how many games go on to Steam Workshop in a year? 3,000? Something like that. It's at least 3,000. It's like a lot of games. How many of them can we name in a year that bubbled up in conversation on Discord or wherever else? Like 10? 15? So that's how little it's happening with like net outcome, right? And that's only on Steam, let alone all these other startups. So if there's only like, I'm going to take a guess here. You guys might know the actual number, but like how many gaming startups were there in the last 3 years? Like 100, 150, 200?
You mean
think
like
about
VC back? Yeah. Okay.
VC back. Like, so think about, hopefully we're all proceeding and presuming as if the proportion or the rate will be any better among the startups. We don't know yet. We hope it is because of these studios tend to be more experienced and everything. But again, even a lot of these experienced studios are experienced in creating games, not experienced in creating systems to last, which is maybe one of the qualities to look for. Who is going to tackle these problem sets? And do you have practice? Do we have confidence that you're able to work on that? Maybe not even just today, but you're even conscious of it. You're like driving toward it. If you hear like, oh, well, like basically fix it in post. We'll fix it in post. Like we'll say it that way, but they'll hear things like, oh, look at our awesome art team and it's going to like look really beautiful. We're going to be really appealing there. Like how many games can we name that look amazing that we don't care about literally weeks later? I don't want to pick on anyone right now, but there's so many of those, right? And that doesn't mean don't have an art team. It just means that like that crutch is working less and less these days. Information is traveling faster. Player sentiment is spreading faster than it ever has. People are declaring dramatically like, oh, good game, dead game, like all that much faster. So, and players don't know and maybe shouldn't know like what went into it. So we could say, oh, we worked on this for 7 years and we've been thinking about this, all this stuff. Like they kind of don't care. If for all that, it's almost even worse. Like you thought about all that and this is what it is today. Like what, that would be pretty sad. And that can so easily happen. So anyway, I think like some of the order of operations here is you need to have confidence. If you are hoping for a perpetual game service, you need to have some base components for that. And that is grossly missing.
What's the attribute of this like designer? I guess Jordan, you might have a perspective here too, but like, if you're a founder today and you're thinking about finding like a founding designer, like what are some of like the bullets that you'd want to make sure that this person hits?
Man, so it's interesting because like Slim, I believe that there are people in other functions that might have very strong feelings, beliefs, and even understandings about game design. And I think it's totally reasonable that be maybe the CEO who has those. It may be some other co-founding engineer. It could be a number of people as long as they have deep understanding and deep experience. So I'll just start with that. I think if they have a full vision, maybe they're actually just a designer, but they have a full vision. Maybe they don't need to have the same degree of willingness to give on that vision. I think it's okay maybe for them to actually be very, very resolved and to try to hire people who are able to fit into their idea or scheme if maybe they're a tastemaker. That's possible. That's one version. I think that's a like rarer version, but actually I think Slim, when I worked with you guys, that's what I would describe you as with Valorant. Like you had a very clear vision to a degree. I think eventually when I was working with you about what Valorant would be. And I even asked Slim, I'm sorry if this is like too much, like what do they need to like? Can they like Halo? And you're like, hell no. Can they like Call of Duty? Absolutely not. Right? Like they need
I say that by the way, not as hopefully not as an elitist standpoint, but from a like those are very different experiences from a competitive standpoint.
To make this game. Right. So Slim was able to tell me, and then that meant, right, I couldn't go find a game designer who felt like those were the types of games that they wanted to potentially work on or enjoyed or whatever. And so Brian, to the question, it's like it depends on the type of game they're making and if they're clear. If they are clear, I think that you want to try and fit within the confines of what they're building because anything else is an impediment. If they are actually really trying to figure it out, because Slim, unfortunately, some people do start without a game director or someone who has all the product vision, say it's an engineering leader and maybe a producer sort of like combo as the founders, and they need to find a designer to start. I think then they need to find someone who's very flexible, who can work with them, who can help them lead down the road. So I think ultimately the characteristics, the behaviors, all the things that they need to find from a first designer or a number of people are really they're a reaction to what else is there, how far along they are in their vision. And it's too reductive to think that there's a formula.
Of course. Yeah.
It's always about reacting. Yeah.
Yeah, like Epic, Riot, Supercell, like the CEOs or the founding team weren't necessarily like designers, but they found the designers, right? They found the right people.
I mean, even I think Blizzard started with mostly engineers. Like, I mean, there's no such thing as like a explicit game designer in like the early 90s or late 80s. They were just, everyone was a game developer. We're kind of returning to that form today. There's a bunch of different tool sets that are useful at different phases of development. I think in general, we're always problem solving. So I think you really want to find people that you have confidence are critical thinkers, problem solvers. How did they know that they are on the right path? How sure are they? Why are they sure? There's an amount of like faith and confidence you need to have to like take a step that are initially like more blind. And then eventually you need to also have qualities of like reflection. Like is this person retroactively like aware and like parsing what happened versus like we are charging down this path come hell or high water, basically some level of like stubbornness. You need a bit of stubbornness to like stick with a vision that people don't see initially, but you have to be reflective and self-aware. Otherwise, you cannot improve. Despite all the motions of playtesting and everything, you will not be in a position to learn from those and to take actions that are more that will lead to more resonance. And so I think those are some of the qualities you want to fish out, regardless of the title, seniority, experience level, discipline. I mean, look at so many games are made by. Look at, again, so many of the games that have been popped off recently that these qualities would not necessarily be readable on LinkedIn. If you looked at only their experience, you could not tell that they were like really problem solving and really like thoughtful through their process, but produced experiences like Valheim and BattleBit and Among Us, like all these games that have popped off that were not from like these storied studios, like, but clearly like dance circles around a lot of us from AAA studios. Like, I think it's those practices and maybe the humility to do that is something to look for in either the very experienced person, which many people stop reflecting, over rely on their experience, and then newer people who are less aware of the problem space. Like either of these can be vulnerable to not do any of these practices. So it's, as you can imagine, it's pretty hard to fish that out. So in a standard interview where you're looking at someone for an hour, can you fish that out? I've interviewed a lot of people and I think it's really tough. I think there's a lot of easier eliminates, but I couldn't get to that level of confidence in an hour. And so should we look at our hiring practices and changes, our interview process and changes there? Currently at our studio, we've been getting recent feedback that our process is longer and more involved than most, and we are losing candidates as a result. But we are very happy with the hires we have. We may have more false negatives in there, whether it's not necessarily us like declining people. Some people just elect out of our process like before it's over, which is what led to some of the feedback. But I so far think it continues to be worth it. It's something that we're monitoring, that I don't think it's like an absolutely like we're right or there's like a right way here. But we do think more time investment has been worth it, considering the prospect of us potentially working together for years. Like, is a few more hours like really that much to ask? It could be if you're someone looking for a job and you're applying to 20 places and it's like, dude, this one company is like really involved, and after all that, it might not have worked out, and then it would feel even worse. So there's steep trade-offs to the way we do it. But if we just proceed with someone off a 1 hour impression, we should not be that surprised when we're having like management tax later, and all that.
So I gotta respond to you on several fronts.
Yeah,
one, you are in a very privileged position to have both the time to do this,
yes,
resources, and in addition, you have some of the most respected game makers on your team. And so your ability to continue to attract and for people to continue process with you, despite putting a lot of impediments in front of them, is higher than basically anyone else in the market. So I respect you a lot. And I think your ability to do this is unusual, very unusual. So the only thing I would remark to anyone who's watching the podcast is like, be mindful about replicating Slim's process, because you don't have probably the same starting point. But
I appreciate that.
In addition to that,
fair, yeah.
Okay. I also want to just say that, there's the science, at least everything I've read on predicting performance states that beyond 6 hours, if you've used your 6 hours very effectively, you have probably reached the limit of your ability to predict their performance in the future. Now, that's in the frame of a structured interview process. The alternative is you've worked with them, or you have references that you can actually trust. The problem is references are typically not any references you can trust, and so basically you should throw them out. So it's either you know them from the past, or you interview them for about 6 hours if you have a very capable interviewing team, a very smart interviewing approach, a number of other things, or you start making some other trades like them staying in process, which I think for Slim's, even though you've gotten this feedback, I'm guessing you experienced less of the downside than some other companies would, or some other founders would.
We just have less traffic, so we don't. If we were like, if we were at Riot again all together and we're doing like 10 a day, and that rate, that word would get spread out, and for better and for worse. So some people would be like, oh, I have a better idea what to expect when I do engage with this company and this experience. And other people were like, that was so dumb. Like they made me they jump through all these hoops, and at the end I didn't even get an offer. Like that will also spread. And so, and either of those are fair. But again, despite that cost, and of course, I'm not talking to an extreme here. Any extreme can be just terrible, but I think more should go into understanding some of those qualities, and you can do that in a short amount of time. But most people haven't developed their interview processes or questions to really reliably get to that. Certainly not for all candidates. So there's a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives that we have to just contend with. But all of this is in trade-off to other pain in the future of like management tax and offboarding and layoffs and all kinds of stuff. Like,
especially if you don't know your product, right?
well, that's like coming back all the way back to that is like,
yeah.
If you don't have that driving North Star, then you're hiring more generically. And if you're hiring more generically, we should not be more surprised when our results are more generic, right?
Yeah, but if we go back to Brian made the point about Pincus and not having a designer. But to be fair, I don't think they really hired the same types of designers almost, until far, far, far into the future of them being a company. Like they looked for more traditional product management, KPI folks, statisticians, and mathematicians.
Clearly they've worked for them.
It was commercially successful. It was very, very successful. But it's important to disambiguate, at least clarify that these are very different profiles that ended up being hired to match the sort of characteristics of the organization's types of products they were building.
Yeah, I will absolutely. While I advocate for this because of my bias, I will also simultaneously not say that it's like certainly the only way or let alone the best way. So it's a way that has worked for our team that gives us confidence, that we think gives our candidates confidence in us and our process, or at least they know what they're stepping into and can then elect into it or elect out of it. And we try to be as upfront about that early in our process as possible. And then the cost of it is like, people electing out. Like, yeah.
Cool. We did want to talk a bit about kind of AI and how that's kind of augmenting the ability for small teams to maybe like punch above their weight and do more, and also obviously help like larger studios become more efficient. So I'm just curious, like for both of you guys, like how are you starting to see like emergent technologies influence like how teams are built and how teams can operate?
Yeah, and is it actually being used, right? I think that's my biggest question. Is like, I think it's great that it's going to be a great new tool that's going to help accelerate a lot of this development. But yeah, like love to see what you guys are actually seeing from like a talent perspective, people leveraging these tools and how it's working out.
The person I am closest to that has been doing a lot of experimentation into this is Travis Boatman at Carbonated. I love it. His eyes like light up when he's like showing me some new tool, and I'm like, I would say I put in about, I don't know, 10 to 15% effort. So not zero, but like not much. And then I stay close to some people who are putting in, I don't know what percentage he would say, but he's putting in more. And he's looking for opportunities to apply it to his problem set. And so I think we're in like state the obvious, we're in very early stages. The tools are just starting to come online and have some amount of promising application. We can only conjecture, like project where it could go. There's a lot of things we can't even really meaningfully predict. So it does seem out of the trends of the past 10 years that have come and gone, this one has a lot more legs to be relevant and applicable. But also we at Raidbase have this feeling that it's just starting. There's nothing we are currently doing that absolutely relies on it, nor do we want to create a dependency on something that is new that may or may not come to fruition at the time that we need it. So we are just more conservative on that front. And thankfully that our problem set doesn't seem to be like so reliant on it. But we are also, I'd like to think, very open-minded to it. So if something comes out that is promising based on outcomes that happen, not just like hopes and dreams, and then it has been repeated by a number of other studios. Basically, it's a little bit has a little bit of rigor. We will then consider it like to be more reliable and more eager to use it. So I think we're very open-minded to it, looking forward to it. I don't know when and where these will be ready. So I'm currently not relying on it, but I do think there's a lot of promise to it. And some people are immediately actioning on it right now, and let alone like the whole category of topic that I don't think we're touching here, which is like what new game experiences are going to result out of this like technological advancement, which happens from time to time, from graphical updates to tool set updates that have unlocked a lot of things. Like I'm not a particularly creative person, so I don't consider myself a particularly creative person, so I can't even like imagine where that will go, but I'll be happy when it happens, and I'll be happy to use any of it for what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like generative AI, there's like one field of work that is going to, persist and be protected. It's probably creative work, right? I mean, it's really tough for general AI to like create full-on creative experiences. And you think about using that as more of a tool versus like a catch-all solution that's going to replace game designers or artists. Like I just personally think that's a really tough world to see. But I guess, yeah, like what are you guys kind of seeing as relates to like that specific part? Like, people, I think that's one of the fears, right? That you're seeing a lot of backlash with AI is like, oh man, like it's going to replace a bunch of jobs and, people are not going to be able to like work in the industry anymore. But that also feels very far-fetched to me. But yeah, like what's your guys' take as relates to that
I
particular
definitely think,
trigger?
yeah, I think it certainly affects. I'm just going to talk about my own personal and not even recruiting experience for half a second. There are things that I now do at work that I would have never done before, whether it's generating some asset that I'm going to use online for marketing. And in effect, it's changed how I now do my work effectively, which might also mean that other people need to respond to me in the same way. And it creates a new standard for some roles, I think, to start leveraging the technology to broaden their impact, where in the past I might have had to go to a graphic designer. There might not have been one at the company. And so it doesn't really matter. Now I can just do stuff. So I think it's fair to say many people across many different functions are likely to be affected because they will become less competitive in their roles if they aren't starting to expand their leverage and using technology to their advantage, whether it's automating spreadsheets or finding ways to more quickly collate survey data or producing a report out of thin air, doing like a ChatGPT thing. These are all like basically skips on your day to day. I think they can save you hours on something that would have been very difficult in the past. Specifically for game development, there are certainly teams that we have who feel less of a need to get a concept artist right away because they feel like they can do rapid concepting and it's reasonable enough. They don't really need to have high fidelity at this point. They just need to have some breadth. And so they can do that. They can do it potentially in 3D as well, which is, pretty scary, I think, to a degree to a lot of artists. And I think it's reasonable for the artist to have a degree of fear. Now, from my personal perspective, there's two sort of paths here. One is that we produce the same amount of output, but it's more efficient, and therefore jobs are affected, right? That's the first version. The second version is we think the increased efficiency that we have actually expands our output, that we make more art or that we make more products, but with the same number of people. So I think it's very possible that plenty of those artists learn how to use these tools and work more with the tools, and it brings greater velocity to their work. Because even if a non-artist can interact with Midjourney or something else, they don't have the lexicon necessarily. They don't have the stylistic understanding. They don't have all the reference points. They cannot be, I don't think, as effective as an artist, even using the tools. And so it makes sense to me that many of the people in those types of functions will eventually be able to be the operators of the tools in a more effective way than some person who wasn't trained in the actual craft of art or of narrative or of whatever other potential sort of role that's being discussed. I think there are other job functions, like maybe being a lawyer who needs to do research. Like, it seems to me more likely that those are affected territories or they have a big impact on pay than is the case in our world in gaming, where effectively there's a non-zero sum amount of content that we can probably generate and potentially market that we can generate, where there is a zero sum in some other functions, I think, to a degree. So I think it means that people have to be reactive, change, grow, leverage the technologies. Maybe some people won't like the work that comes from that. You know, maybe they liked drawing and they don't like sort of putting in a bunch of prompts and, you know, modifying. But it seems to me that it is unlikely to fully destroy the job market for these categories of functions that are critically important for the games that we like to play and make.
Yeah, there's so many qualities to look for in any candidate in any discipline. Skill set is one. And you can imagine just generically, let's use art since we were talking about it as an example, where when an artist is first starting out, a lot of art is natural to learn by mimicking. And so you look at certain artists that inspire you, you start to mimic their style. Eventually you get confidence, you start branching out to your own and developing your own taste and style, or you're influenced by things along the way and you start deviating. And that's like a typical natural progression. And so maybe not by accident, maybe this feeds into how some of the AI is being developed. We're seeing current AI tech like mimicking certain art skills. But I think you can quickly generate all this art. Somebody, maybe for some people, they'll even rely on AI to do this, but judgment is another vector. Who judges out of this pile of like 100 pieces of art that we just generated, like, this is the one we're going to run with instead of this one, and why, and how is it connected to the other things? Not to say that couldn't be also eventually mimicked or simulated, but there will be probably a huge range of tolerance or thresholds for people who are more inclined or less inclined to rely on that. So you think about like the stakes of what you're doing. Is there a day where there is a government that will rely on an AI to have its finger on the nuke? Like, you can take it all the way to that. And for some people, you don't have to be as that dramatic, but like for a game, how reliant are you wanting to be on that? I'm sure there's some where like, I don't know anyway, and my judgment not any better, so I'm just gonna like let the robot handle it. There's going to be inevitably some studios that want to lean more into that, and then some are like, this is the whole thing of what I do. Like, I am the judge. I am confident. I did spend a lifetime feeding my algorithm of like playing thousands of hours of Counter-Strike. I can stick it to my parents and I'm like, see, it was all worth it. but like, that's why I rely on my judgment in some spaces, but not in all spaces. And so it really depends, I think, what we're doing, where we came from to I think, influence to what degree is this adopted. So even if the tech is available, I still might not choose to adopt it in many cases because it's something that we think we are stronger at or something like that. So maybe it's like a complementary tool to wherever you aren't, that you might be more open to it maybe. But yeah.
I mean, so much of game development or any kind of creative work is like, you need a lot of soul and taste and things, I think, that are really
at least
tough
we think
to
so.
replicate.
But some people don't. Some people are like, stick it into the robot and the robot spits out an answer and it works for a while and a lot of money gets made in it. It's fine too. It also works. Right. But we all have our different style. Like some people, not everyone goes to make a game for the same purpose. And so therefore will have different problem sets and have different tools at their disposal and their inclinations to leverage any of these things. So we're going to continue to see variety, and maybe with all these, maybe even, again, if you consider this currently, and maybe one day it's beyond this, but currently as like the overall tool set, that should theoretically, and so far has been, expanding the scope of attempts and viability for different teams to attend. So the proportions might like shift over time, but overall, if it expands, there should hopefully always persist some area of games that aren't using it and that won't take away everyone's opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it also goes to say, like, is AI used as like an efficiency tool where it's like there is an outcome, and whether that outcome is like fully manual or fully AI or something hybrid, versus I think both Brian and you, Stephen, mentioned there's also just going to be like emergent gameplay and emergent experiences that just couldn't exist before without AI. And I think those are the things that, again, that's less about dev tools and less about middleware and making people more efficient, and more about like what type of interactions can exist now that couldn't exist otherwise. And I think that's something where like that will create like new markets, and there's going to be new developers that are trying to experiment with the technology in that way. And I think that will also impact kind of like what teams form, how big do teams need to be, what is the right kind of core team look like to build that kind of experience. Like that's all going to be very different than what it took to make like a traditional game that wasn't using that.
Yeah, I think it's actually like the solo devs that get the most benefit too, right? You think about on Steam, there's a lot of these like incredible games that's made by one or two developers, and like they're probably limited in terms of like resources and the output, right? So in theory, I feel like that's like where you're going to see a lot of leverage.
It's like, to the point, like they have the most complementary need.
Yeah.
So
Right.
they can accelerate that. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
or even
probably
like
even
what we
more.
talked about earlier with like Roblox and like some of these games that like today may not, from like a like let's just say from like a graphic perspective, may not be like on par with like a AAA studio. Like, you know, what's to stop a platform in the future? Maybe it's Roblox, they're going to do it themselves, but what's to stop kind of helping close that gap for those like single developers or solo developers that's going to go build these things, right?
I think it's also maybe reasonable to believe that the largest developers take the potential efficiency gains as margin, but effectively that might shift the resourcing, the people, the humans into smaller or more nascent studios. So that's a double win, Brian, from my perspective. It's not only that the solo developers get greater degree of functionality, but they also potentially get more access to talent.
Cool. I guess any other thoughts or topics you guys want to comment on this time? I know we've already gone on for about 70 minutes.
Let me think here. We've already, the main message I wanted to hopefully encourage people was like not to just, I don't know, to be thoughtful as they like leap into the void. There's already like so many things to take a leap on as we develop the early steps of making a game. But we talked a bit about, you know, exacerbating that with also leaping on recruiting and hiring and
let me
building trust and stuff.
I have one question based on a follow-up. You mentioned, and Jordan, when you guys were working together on Valorant team, Slim had a very specific view on like Halo, Call of Duty, like specific games as like what experience is relevant, or like what type of experience do you want someone to have in order to fit the core mold of like what you guys are building? How important is it for a new founder to have clarity? Like, to what degree of clarity should they have around either audiences that they're going after or the type of game that they want to build, especially as it relates to hiring the early team?
I'm either the right guy or the wrong guy to ask, but that's like the most paramount thing. Like I said, don't even freaking dare to start like without clarity on that, because then what are you basing every other action on? It's just more random. So not to say success couldn't be had, but I'll have a tough time believing it wasn't super random like that you got there. And of course, it's not like the way I'm encouraging is like a for sure thing too. It's like, in my eyes, like just a step towards a higher hit rate of outcome and a narrowing of like just more things out of your control over time. And like, again, I've rarely been like so sure about anything. Like when I say having more confidence, like I want to get more than halfway, like 60% sure. I'll take that as to take a few steps. And then from there, maybe I'm now 70% sure, 80% sure. We're like accumulating that confidence. And hopefully, if you can afford to, doing that before asking others to take that leap of faith. Otherwise, it's like, I have a shaky foundation. I'm asking you to join my shaky foundation. Now we have like double the complexity. Yeah. It's like I see that way too much than I would like. That then leads to like scenarios where you're like, how are you like surprised that this outcome was freaking random? So I think it's paramount to draw on something. I lean a lot on empathy with a particular audience. I do not ever profess to empathize with all audiences. I actually think I have a pretty narrow band within multiplayer experiences. Like categorically, I don't even understand 1v1 games. Like I don't profess to like anything in that category. Like I played 6 years of Warcraft 3, but 2v2. I can't even say anything about 1v1 RTSs. Fighting games, card games. I just shut up. I was like, I don't know anything about those spaces, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about squad or group dynamic type games, and regardless of genre labels. So my brain spiders out to that. So wherever you can draw from, it doesn't have to only be you, but of course, if you're pushing this, it's a good starting point. And then there's a matter of like, okay, so we have like a general direction, but then how do we get this shit to actually work? And again, that's where you want someone who's practiced that, like connecting those dots, dealing with those variables, getting them to all like play together. That is like someone's lifetime of practice. And so I think that is like also paramount because it's like a next step. And then even if you do that reasonably well, when I say reasonable, I mean like we're in a ballpark. We're not like at a pinpoint. We're like somewhere over here. But without that definition, then how do you even know for any given topic if it's inside this and aligned, roughly aligned, or sounds good in a vacuum, but is like entirely opposed to the momentum we already been building? Most people don't do this work, so they proceed day by day, just zigzagging, just like getting yanked like from one side to the other, and that is very, very fatiguing. So on top of then the challenge of like problem solving this, you're dealing with a team that is increasing in fatigue and has lower and lower patience. So eventually someone just gives up and is just like, fine, let's just do it that way. And then that decision right there, to me, is extremely arbitrary. It's just somebody tilted, somebody yielded, somebody pushed harder, somebody yelled louder. And then that's how that we ended up with this. And now we're asking a team of 3 pods and 50 people like to like go along with this. If you trace the root, like ultimately it's some arbitrary decision. Like, again, you do this 3 times a day, 20 times a week, 100 times a month. Like it's just, you get to really random outcomes. Yeah.
I'll only say that I believe that people are all very different, and what works for teams is very different. What made me, I think, effective as a recruiter was understanding the unique nature of the people or the groups of people that I was interacting with and trying to complement those teams. Some teams need executors. Some teams need stabilizers. Some teams need someone who will come in and like be a catalyst. Teams need very different things and at different times. So it's difficult for me to answer this question other than to say you need to, I think Slim's right in saying you need to be self-aware, know what you have or don't, try to like itemize or inventory what you're trying to accomplish. Or if you don't know, being able to say, I don't know, and this is what I need to fill in, and trying to figure out the next headcount or the next person who will bring some of those skills or be a good match for you and your team's personality.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like there's of course no one size fits all, but it's about every situation is unique, and you want to build that right core that can kind of like cohesively mesh together and all march in that same kind of North Star direction. Yeah.
Even what you just said there, Jason, as a nice summary that I super agree with. Like you just said, of course, no one size fits all. I don't believe that the majority of developers that I've encountered, particularly among the experienced set, actually takes that as a given. If you actually look at their behaviors, in a conversation, they might all nod their heads, but when you look at their actual behaviors and decisions, they don't actually operate under that perspective or under that paradigm. And again, maybe to the spirit of what we're saying here, like what I'm not advocating for is that this is like the only way or right way. But if you're going to do it your other way, you need to like, to Jordan's point, be aware of the trade-offs in your way and then complement as such.
Yeah, I think one last topic I wanted to chat with you guys about was comp and structuring it in this new world, right? Where burn is just like a super sensitive topic. I think at least from like our perspective as early stage investors, like we also like founders that are trying to hire people that are not centered around like super high salary or like a very comfortable lifestyle, right? And in our opinion, there should be like a bigger option pool. And I think that's a great thing about equities is it aligns incentives. So like when you win, and if you're more generous as a founder with equity to your employees, like you can all win together and there's more incentive for people to stick around and see that vest. But I guess from like your guys' perspective, like how do you think about comp in this world? And like, you know, what are some of the things that you think about as it relates to hiring people and how that impacts like the type of people you hire all the way to retention, and I guess even from like cost cutting perspective, like how does this all factor in?
This is also another hugely complicated topic and charged
with our
topic.
3 minutes. Yeah,
I was like, so many things flying through my head. Okay, so on comp at a startup, typically there will be, of course, base pay and then some amount of equity and some promise of future bonus. Currently,
no immediate cash bonuses. There shouldn't be immediate cash bonuses typically.
Yeah, it's like it's basically pretty arbitrary if anyone does that. It's like what would it be based off of? Okay, so with equity, there's still, I think, a large I would even go so far as to say a majority, as in more than half of developers that I've encountered, do not actually understand equity. So they don't value it or appreciate it, even if we as founders do, or investors do, because we're in this world. And I don't blame most developers, even if they understand it, for not appreciating it, because there aren't as many examples historically where equity has meaningfully impacted their finances as bonuses did. So there's more people who are appreciative of bonuses that they can understand a little bit better. And it's all a matter of treatment too. There are bonus systems where it's like a black box and they have no idea how they got what number they got, or they draw conclusions because they don't understand that, like, oh, someone was just around 10 years longer than me and that's why they drive a McLaren into the parking lot and I don't, and I'm struggling to pay my rent in Irvine. Like, that is an actual real thing that many of my fellow developers struggled with for a long time. And like, and so it's all over the place. I guess at the end of the day, we should all take steps as founders or in the recruiting process to help people understand it and educate them, even if it may be detrimental to our own hiring. I go to that extent. I'm like, sometimes I explain it to the point where I'm almost talking them out of joining a startup or staying where they're at. And it hurts to do that, but I'd rather have that conversation now than a year later where you're like, where's my bonus? How come I didn't get a raise? How come I didn't get the 20% raise that I'm getting every year at Riot? Like, there are some people, I remember those eras where people were like, I only got a 15% raise this year. And you're like, dude, I worked at EA for like 5 years before I got a 10% raise. What planet are we on?
And 270% bonus.
Yeah, you're like, what in the world? Yeah.
I want to give you like the sort of short version. I think a lot of time founders, managers, they think they need to have a certain person, a certain talent. And to Slim's point, like, some of them evaluate that form of compensation equity as something they cannot accept. I think the reality is the founder or the team needs to redesign their plan and figure out how to find the person who has the appropriate motivation, not to try and compete for every piece of talent on the market that they think is the right talent. Because ultimately, you don't have the same resources as these other companies. You cannot go toe to toe with them, period. If you can in the near term, you won't in the long term, because those people will have higher pay. They will continue to get bombarded by recruiters. It's just like, it's just going to keep going. So ultimately, if you find the appropriate motivation, number one, and you can convince them, meaning you show them functional capability, product clarity, whatever they need to believe in you as a leader, your company, and your vision, then their acceptance of equity is much, much easier. Now, I agree with Slim that less people have won on equity in our space, but plenty have, right? Thousands of developers from Riot and many from Scopely and Zynga and blah, blah, blah. So I would at least try to believe that you'll eventually find the right person and be willing to let go the wrong one who really is stuck on having guaranteed comp, and otherwise they're not going to make a choice.
And wrong for you in that situation, not necessarily wrong, because everyone has their own motivation for why they need cash comp today versus have the ability to have like equity comp later. But I think having that alignment,
mortgage or whatever,
of course,
There's another thing that I want to say that hopefully isn't too spicy, but in general, if someone is giving you abnormally high comp, I think that you need to be careful that they're buying something, because trust that people don't pay when they don't have to. And so if they are going out of their way, what most people read is, oh, they finally someone appreciates me. And that might be true. That might be like a big component. It's like it's a nice thing, something that feels good. That's an ego boosting thing. But in reality, part of what they might be paying for is your name, your credibility, a press release in some cases. And in other cases, they want you to put up with something. There's some deficiency they haven't been successful in hiring for, and so they start pumping up the number until they find someone who will bite. And that means you should be as aware as possible what you're walking into to get this pay. That, like, it's basically hazard pay. Like, why are they paying this much for this thing? And then let's see what else. I'm
more nervous they just mismanage their finances in that case.
Yeah. Sometimes math is hard. Yeah, it's big numbers are. Yeah.
Well, I was trying to find a nice way of saying, like, the bigger companies have to pay more because there are some frustrating challenges at each of these that they have to compete. And you can take the higher pay, and you should, not to say anyone shouldn't complain, but you should be aware that you're stepping into that, and you need to eat that and trade for that pay. So there's trade-offs any which way you go that you should try to think through. And it's not for free to get the highest pay offer in many cases.
Cool. Any last word, Jordan? Otherwise, really appreciate you guys like hopping on, and it was a really fun conversation. And yeah, I mean, I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks
so much for having us.
Thank you guys.
It was great.